Hello, I'm Ed Conway. Welcome to my study, and I wanted to give you a bit of an update on how the economy is doing. There's been a lot of focus, and I've certainly been spending a lot of time looking at the grisly, depressing news on health and what's going on there. But of course, there is an economic side to this as well, and in a way, the big focus over the course of the coming month is going to be about the economy rather than being about health, because we're starting to see a real impact now on many of our jobs. And what we've got, and the reason why I wanted to talk to you, is what we're starting to see is some evidence of just where it is hitting the economy and what it means for the rest of us, and also just how vast some of these schemes, these government schemes, have been. We've just got numbers out from the Treasury on that. It's kind of, there's some interesting stuff in there. But first of all, you'll probably remember, like, certainly my first interaction with this COVID-19 crisis actually wasn't about health, it was about markets, because markets started to tumble early on. And what's happened since then? Well, have a look at what's happened to share prices over the course of the past 6 months. This chart shows you it. You know, there was a very big fall, one of the biggest falls we had ever seen in share prices. There's my arrow to show how bad it was. That was one of the worst falls, actually, over that month since the South Sea bubble in the early 18th century. So an enormous fall there. But what's been interesting, actually, is that markets have really recovered a lot of ground since then. Less so in the UK. So this is the FTSE 100. The Dow Jones and the S&P and the Nasdaq are up to, or got up to more or less where they were at the start of the year. But just in the last day, in the last 24 hours, we've seen a bit of a fall, down by kind of 3-4% in the UK, and similar kind of amounts, if not more, in Wall Street. There are concerns, just, you know, this stuff is nebulous, but there are concerns, obviously, about the risk of a second wave. So investors out there getting a bit concerned again, getting a bit concerned. And I suppose it's not surprising, given that a lot of the economic news at the moment is quite bad. There has been this big question about, you know, after the kind of life support system that has been implemented for the economy, so the furlough scheme, and I'll get onto some of the kind of numbers we have on that in a moment. Do those jobs come back, or do employers just cut them, particularly in certain sectors like kind of aviation, and where they've been really affected by this? And I'm afraid some of the news initially has been very bad. So we've had jobs numbers, job losses actually announced by Centrica. So they've announced 5,000 job losses in the UK. That's kind of a quarter of their workforce. Johnson Matthey, 2,500 jobs there, and Bombardier 600 jobs. That's in Northern Ireland, very big employer in Northern Ireland, Bombardier. So those are not by any means good news. And when you have a look at the kind of state of the economy, the concern is there may well be more job losses, and the bad news is kind of yet to come. What we got today from the Treasury is, for the first time, they released details on the kinds of jobs that have been covered by the furlough scheme. So we know that a lot of people have been put onto furlough. They've had their wages paid by the state. We know that's kind of getting towards 10 million, particularly if you include self-employed people. But what we didn't really know is what the sectors they were in. We had a hunch they might be in things like restaurants and retail, but we didn't know for sure. Now, finally, we have that number. So we have this table. You can't probably read it there. There's lots of interesting details, though. And one thing I was struck by, if we kind of zoom into it, and this is not the most important thing I know in the world, but just look at this. As well as including all these other things like retail, they also included this domestic employers. It turns out, actually, there have been 6,000 people, I guess families around the country, who have used the furlough scheme to support, whether it's their cleaner or nannies. It has been used. £15 million that has cost the taxpayer. The Treasury perhaps keen to underline that the furlough scheme hasn't just been about big companies, it's also been helping out people back home. But as I say, the big impact is probably the companies that you would imagine. What I've done is I've taken all of these numbers here of the number of, that's the number of people, number of jobs, number of employees, amount it's cost, and I've done it as a percentage of workforce. So you get a sense by sector about how much they've been affected. And it's, well, it's more or less as you'd expect. So have a look at this. You've got, perhaps most obviously, you know, food and accommodation down at the bottom there, getting towards 60% of all jobs in restaurants and hotels have been furloughed. Probably not a surprise to you, but nonetheless, and that's on the basis, I should say, that's on the basis of the employment numbers kind of a year or so ago. So you're talking about the vast majority of people within restaurants and hotels in furlough. Retail as well, again, won't surprise you, but that's kind of about 50% or so of retail, people working in retail have been furloughed. But construction, this is the interesting thing. Manufacturing and construction, particularly construction, two industries that weren't really supposed to, shut down in the way that other parts of the economy did. A lot of kind of speculation about it at the time, but construction, people were supposed to be able to carry on working, particularly in building sites in the open air. But actually, getting towards 50% of all construction workers have been furloughed. So it is striking, how this scheme has been used, not just for parts of the economy that were obviously locked down, but actually by parts of the economy that weren't locked down at all, in a big way. Construction, manufacturing, to a lesser extent as well. Property, I guess, there's a fair few estate agents who have been furloughed as a result of the lockdown because they can't necessarily do their jobs. But it is just striking looking at this, and also what we have as a regional breakdown. I want to show you the regional breakdown. It's striking just how far across the entire economy this goes. There's some sectors that are barely affected. Education, actually, interestingly, farming and finance. A lot of people, very few jobs in finance and IT were furloughed. But really, when you look across the economy, when you look across the country, it's hard to think of any other policy that's been quite so prevalent and widespread as this one. And you get a sense of that when you kind of break it down by regions, and that's what I've done here. So this shows you different regions of the UK, from the West Midlands all the way through to Wales. And actually, in a way, what's striking about this is not the difference between them. It's the West Midlands at the top and Wales at the bottom there. But it's not the difference between them. But the fact that they are all kind of within this range of about 21, 22 to 25% of employees getting furloughed across all of the UK. This has been a kind of nationwide thing. That's what is kind of interesting. It has been a real UK-wide policy that has affected many people around the country, and most regions have been relatively equally affected. But actually what's intriguing is when you break it down by local authorities, there are some hotspots, some places that have more furloughing than other places. And let me just show you a few of them, because it's rather interesting. It shows you some of the subtext of what's been going on in this crisis. So there I've got a kind of heat map across, it's Great Britain, this, unfortunately didn't have breakdown for Northern Ireland of the employment numbers, but this shows you a breakdown, and the more blue these areas are, the more people went into furlough as a percentage of local employment. And let me just show you a few highlights, because obviously this is difficult to see probably on the screen, but let me just zoom in a little bit. There, we will go in to Crawley, and in Crawley, actually, of all local authorities around the UK, the most furloughed jobs as a percentage of employees, 33, getting on for 34% of all employees furloughed, 20,000 jobs furloughed. Now, what's significant about Crawley? It's Gatwick. That's where Gatwick is. And you're going to see a pattern here. So Crawley, Gatwick, a real hotspot for furlough. Let's move and see the next biggest furlough spot. That was South Lakeland. So the Lake District, a big tourist hotspot, really important tourism. And obviously tourism has been obliterated by COVID-19. So in South Lakeland, you've got 33% of employees furloughed. And so you're seeing kind of definite hotspots of places where more people, on balance have been furloughed. So a third of workers in those two places, and more or less similar numbers in Pendle. Now Pendle's interesting because I believe there's a Rolls-Royce plant around there, so that's been quite important, and Rolls-Royce have said that they've furloughed a lot of their employees, so about a third, just under a third in Pendle. And in Hounslow, well, that's Heathrow in Hounslow, so there are some interesting analogies here, some interesting kind of things when you look down forensically in the numbers at who's been affected. And when you kind of have a look at the places which have been least affected in terms of the least furloughing, well, again, there's a pattern. It's mostly in London that you've seen the least furloughed areas. So Camden has the fewest proportion of people who have taken up the furlough scheme, followed by Kensington and Chelsea, City of Westminster and City of London also, I think, between those two. But it just shows actually London areas did the least amount of furloughing, whereas there was some regional divergence with other places more affected. And this is, I think, the worry, okay? the furlough scheme in a way is telegraphing where there might well be job losses in the future. You know, some of these companies, they start off by furloughing, then they take a call in a few months' time, and then, because furlough is kind of essentially free money to support your employees, and then the job losses come later on. So I suspect, you know, the worry about this to me is you're going to see a kind of regional element to the unemployment that comes with some hotspots for unemployment in the future. And it looks like a lot of them might well be outside of London. So again, that regional divergence that we've often talked about being an issue there. Now, this is all really expensive, as you probably realise. We're starting also to get a sense of just how expensive. And it's not just when it comes to the cost of kind of nannies and housekeepers and cleaners. The total cost of the furlough scheme is now kind of getting towards about £20 billion, and then add on top of that the self-employment scheme, and you're kind of getting close to £30 billion in terms of the total cost of this. It's basically, you know, you put it all together and it's definitely kind of costing more than the NHS, which I think is not something anyone had necessarily countenanced. And the worry is with that the longer this goes on, the more the risk of higher unemployment in the future. Now, that's the latest update. We are starting to get more of a sense of where jobs have been furloughed, where jobs may be lost in the future. The story is not especially encouraging, but I think this is going to be the story of the next 6 months. It's a story of an economy facing a very, very deep recession, and we're now starting to see the evidence of that.